Good evening, everyone.
My name is Regine Capon. Now this is my report. So, variation in national income. Variation sample is the plan for revenue. Every money received in the economy is tested by the income method. Cash flows, often known as revenue, are produced by the provision of products and services. Every output produced in an economic needs to be compensated in kind because this method automatically accounts for overseas purchase. There is no need to calculate imports in this instant. Number 2 is the financial plan. The spending strategy is based on the idea that other people's money is what other people spend. As with the revenue technique, we can theoretically arrive at the precise value by adding up all the economic costs. 3 is the strategy of value addition. Every extra value produced at every stage of the production process is added. Nonetheless, assuming all the value-added steps are computed accurately, the total should add up to the product's ultimate value. This implies that the value-added strategy and the spending approach both do in theory yield at the same result. So the data is national income. National income is the total worth of goods and service generated inside a nation boundaries over a given time period. Often, a year is referred to as national income. It is a crucial sign of the strength and expansion of a nation economy. The national income is composed of various elements such as: one is GDP, stands for Gross Domestic Product, which is the total worth of all products and services generated inside the nation boundaries. It consists of export less imports, government spending, investment, and consumption. The GDP less depreciation are the value of assets that theoretically or become outdated over time is the net national product.
The income method. Example, ang pamaraan ng kita ay kinakulala ang pambansang kita batay sa kita ng kadahilanan. Ang mga kita ng matanggap ng bawat residente ng isang bansa para sa mga produktibong serbisyo na ibinigay sa kanila sa loob ng isang taong ay dinagdag ng makasama upang matukoy ang pambansang kita ng isang ekonomiya. Sa madaling salita, sa ilalim ng paraan ng kita, ng pakalkula, ng pambansang kita, ang lahat ng kita ng isang bansa na nakakuha ng mga kadahilanan ng paggawa sa pamagitan ng upa, sahod, kita, interes, at ATBP ay idinagdag ng makasama para sa papasiyan ng pambansang kita. Then, 2. The expenditure method. Ang pamaraan ng paggasta ay isang sistema para sa pagkula ng Gross Domestic Product, GDP, na pinagsasama ang pagkonsumo, pagmumuhanan, paggasta ng gobyerno at mga net export. Ito ang pinakakaraniwang paraan upang matanya ang GDP. Sinabi nila ang lahat na ang pribadong sektor, kabilang ang mga pamilya at pribadong kumpanya, ang panggasta ng gobyerno sa loob ng mga hangganan ng isang partikular na bansa ay dapat madagdag ng hanggang sa kabuuang halaga ng lahat, na ang pagkatapos ng kalakal at serbisyo ginawa sa isang tiyak na tagal na panahon at pamaraan. Ito ay gumawa ng nominal na GDP na dapat pagkatapos ay nababagay para sa implementation na magresulta sa totoong GDP. Number 3. The output method. Sample. Sa pamamaraan nito, ang pambansang kita na bansa ay mamaaring kalkulahin sa pamagitan ng pagdaragdag ng output ng lahat mga kumpanya at ekonomiya upang matukoy ang output ng bansa. Ng pamaraan ng produkto ay kilala rin biglang paraan ng output o paraan ay dinagdag sa halaga sa pamaraan to. Kinakalkula namin ang pambansang kita sa mga tuntunin ng pangwakas ng kalakal ay serbisyo na ginawa sa isang ekonomiya, isang partikular tagal ay panahon ang pangwakas ng kalakal ay mga paggagamit sa mga pamili para sa pangkonsumo o maging bahagi ng pambansang kayamanan sa anyo ng pamumuhunan. Then, sample. Pamagitan ng bawat paggawa ng negosyo sa domestic teritoryo ng isang bansa, isang nagbibigay ng panahon ng accounting. Next. Variant of national income. Sample. Kasama dito ang kita ng lahat ng kadahilanan ng paggawa tulad ng upa, sahod, kita, at interes. Number 2. Gross Domestic Product, GDP. Sample. Ang malaga ng merkado ng lahat na pangwakas ng serbisyo at kalakal na ginagawa sa loob ng isang bansa sa isang naibibigay sa tagal ng panahon. Example, ang formula ng GDP ay GDP equal C plus G at plus I plus NX. Guys, mao dyan na sa kuan guys sa example sa GDP na formula na kung saan ang paggasta ng gobyerno C equal pagkonsumo ay equal pamuhanan at NX equal net export. Net national income. Ito ang tawag sa GDP minus ng pagkakaubos. Ang pagkalugi ay pagsusuot at luha sa mga kagamitan sa kapital at bisal. And number 2, variable concept of national income. Ang pambansang kita ay isang napahalagang konsepto sapagkat pinapayagan tayong magsukat ang kagalingan ng ekonomiya ng isang bansa. Ginamit din ito sa mga modelo ng microeconomic upang matukoy ng mga bagay tulad ng antas ng mga trabaho at exploitation. 3 factors that affect the national income of a country. Labor. Example. Para sa kuha, ang trabaho ay hindi pangalawa sa kagalagahan. Maliwanag, ito ay mula sa katotohanan na ang hindi nabuong lupain ay walang lumalaki, kundi ang mga damo. Nang walang tulong ng mga tao, ang pamantayan na pamuhay ng isang bansa ay direktang proporsyonal sa bilang ng mga produktibong mamayaman at pagiging produktibo ng kanilang paggawa. Ang output ng ekonomiya ay magiging malaki kung ang workforce ay mahusay. Ang laki nito ang proportional sa mga gamit na paraan, subsistence, maliit ba ito kung ang workforce ay malnourished, hindi maganda ang damit at may bahay, walang edukasyon at hanggarin at hindi kumana ng produktibo. Tama. Kapital. Kapol. Koy ng antas na paggawa, ang mga pagkukunan sa manalapi ay kilala. Ngayon bilang mahalaga sa tagumpay ng anuman negosyo, ang pabansang kita ay hindi maaring maging nakapataas kung ang kapital ay binubuo ng mga tuol ng bato. Ngunit ang mga mas bago uri ng halaman ay ginagamit sa pagmanufaktura. Silang mamalakas ang output ng isang bansa. Next. Enterprises, guys. Enterprise. Sample. Ang dami ang kalidad ng mga negosyante ay malaki sa laki ng pambansang kita. Then, malaki. Last, advantage of national income. National income, kung ang pinuno ng negosyo ay kakayanin, makikita nila ang pinakamahusay na balanse sa pangitaan ng iba't ibang kadalilanan ng paggawa ng nagreresulta sa isang mataas na kabubuang output kung ang tagapamahala ng isang bansa ay hindi hanggang sa citizens and makikita ng GDP yun lang.
And now we discuss gross domestic product. In macroeconomics, the most common way economists and policymakers measure the health and overall economy is by examining gross domestic product or GDP. So gross means total and domestic means a country borders, and product means the value of all goods and services produced. However, that's a bit of an oversimplification, so let us look at the complete definition. So gross domestic product is the value of all final goods and services produced when a country borders in a given year. So note the emphasis on final in a given year. Final goods are also called finished good. A final good is one that will not be sold again as part of some other good. If a baker buy flour, sugar, and butter, we don't count those a final good because the baker will use those goods to make a cake. In other words, they are goods that are not finished yet. They are intermediate goods. Now, the cake and the baker made using that flour, sugar, and butter is a final good. Since the cake is the final product and it's a final destination in other consumer. In the other words, a customer will buy it and consume it. There are also goods that are used to make the other goods but are still considered final goods. These are called capital goods. For example, if a farmer buy combine to harvest his crops, the combine is considered a final goods. Even though the combine is used to produce other goods, it won't be sold again as part of another goods. These are also capital goods used to provide services counted as final goods. For example, if a landscaper buys a chainsaw in order to take down trees, the chainsaw is considered a final goods. GDP also counts production in a given year. So if an old car is sold this year, economists don't count it's a part of GDP since the car was not produced this year. They only count new cars sold this year as part of GDP. Also, production is only counted if the goods or services is produced within a country borders. For example, if you are in the United States and buy a shirt imported from Vietnam, that adds to Vietnam GDP, not the United States GDP. But a movie made in United States that is shown that in theaters in Vietnam adds to the United States GDP. It's helpful to think of the entire economy of a country as one big hypermart store, meaning they sell pretty much everything you could possibly ever want to buy, not just product like foods and clothing, but also services like pet grooming and tax preparation. every time a consumer buys a final Every time a consumer buys a final good or services, we record the cost, just like at cash register. All the costs combined over a given year is the GDP. So government economists often divide four goods and services into four categories. Number one is customer goods and services, business goods and services, government goods and services, and net export. So net export are found by simply adding export and subtracting imports. Government economists can also calculate GDP using other method. Instead of adding up all the stuff that consumers, business, and government buys, it can add up to the incomes in the economy. There are also nominal GDP and real GDP. So nominal GDP is measured in current prices, and real GDP is measured in constant or uncharging prices. In other words, real GDP is nominal GDP but adjusted for inflation. Real GDP is more accurate way to measure economic growth since inflation can distort the actual value of goods and services. However, GDP is not a perfect way to assess the health of a country economies. First of all, GDP does not take into account many things that could be considered part of economy. For example, it don't measure non-market activities or goods and services that people make or do themselves, like moving their own lawn or washing their own car. It doesn't measure the underground economy, like in the black market or market for illegal goods, as well as transactions that are legal but simply not but not but simply not reported. GDP also doesn't measure unintended negative externalities. For example, a power plant that creates air pollution by emitting dust and smoke into the air is not subtracted from the GDP. GDP makes not adjustment for leisure time. For example, if workers get more time off in one country yet produce the same amount, they are not rewarded for it. GDP counts goods and services even when those goods and services are created after disasters. For example, if a tornado wipes out a building, GDP automatically increase when a new building takes its place. And finally, GDP doesn't account for how goods and services are distributed. It doesn't affect the GDP of if lots is produced and most of it only goes to small minority of wealthiness individuals. One way economists attempt to calculate a slightly more accurate measure of a country economy is by figuring out its GDP per capita. Like the name suggests, to get GPT per capita, you just take a country's GDP and divide it by its population. To quickly illustrate these differences, let's look at Germany and China. In 2020, China GDP was 17.7 trillion USD and Germany GDP was 3.8 trillion USD. However, Germany GDP per capita was $45,724 and China GDP per capita was just $10,511. Some economists have called for alternatives to GDP in order to more accurate assess the health of country economy with a general emphasis on quality life. Some of these alternatives include the Human Development Index, Inclusive Wealth Index, and Genuine Progress Indicator. Regardless, Inclusive Wealth Index and regardless, gross domestic product continues to be go-to metric government policymakers rely on the planning for country's economy future because institutions are better equipped to measure its component and the clarity of its definition reduce the likelihood of infusing bias. So in this way, GDP definition reduce the likelihood of infusing in this way GDP remains the primary to quickly measure the health of an economy.